All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. We always like to bring you guys the most relevant deep dives. And today we're talking about something that's been in the news quite a bit lately.
It really has.
And it's a pretty key concept for you UPSC folks out there, too.
Absolutely.
We're going to be taking a deep dive into the National Security Act, the NSA.
Yeah, the NSA, it's definitely making headlines, especially with what's going on in Manipur right now.
Exactly. And that connection to a real-world situation is exactly why we thought this would be such a good deep dive. Because, let's face it, sometimes these legal concepts can feel a little, well, dry.
They can, but when you see them playing out in a complex region like Manipur, it suddenly becomes much more real, much more urgent.
Totally. So let's break it down, shall we? For those who might not be totally familiar with it, what exactly is the NSA? Like, elevator pitch it for us.
Okay, so in the simplest terms, think of it this way. The NSA allows the government to detain someone if they believe that person poses a threat to national security or public order.
Okay, so even before they've actually done anything.
Exactly. It's about preventing a potential threat, not punishing a crime that's already happened. That's why it's called preventive detention.
Preventive detention. That sounds a little bit, I don't know, controversial. Holding someone without formal charges?
You're hitting on a key point right there. The NSA has always been a subject of intense debate. To really get it, though, you got to look back, historically. Where'd this all come from? It didn't just pop up out of nowhere in 1980.
Give us the SparkNotes history lesson, then. What were some of the predecessors to the NSA?
All right, well, even back in the colonial era, you had laws like the Bengal Regulation III of 1818, and then later the Rowlatt Acts in 1919. These laws allowed for detention based on suspicion, often without even a trial.
So even before India's independence, this idea of preventative detention was already in play. What happened after 1947?
Well, India adopted the Preventive Detention Act in 1950. But it eventually expired. Then came the Maintenance of Internal Security Act, MISA, in 71, during Indira Gandhi's time. But then the Janata Party, they repealed it in 77.
Because
A lot of concerns about its misuse, But then when Indira Gandhi came back to power, she brought back a similar law. And, well, that's basically the NSA we have today.
So the NSA, it's carrying this whole baggage, this whole legacy of controversy with it. And now it's being considered in Manipur, which, as you said, is a pretty complex region. Could you give us a quick rundown? What's the situation on the ground right now?
Yeah, so Manipur's been seeing a lot of unrest and violence lately. You have ceasefire violations by these insurgent groups, tensions in these buffer zones between communities, and even violent protests.
Sounds like a real tinderbox.
Yeah, it's a really tough situation. A lot of historical grievances, socioeconomic issues, and, these ongoing peace processes that are just, well, they're fragile.
Definitely a lot to unpack there. Okay, so before we get into how all of this is playing out in Manipur, let's dig a little deeper into the NSA itself. For those of us who aren't exactly legal experts, what does the act actually allow the government to do?
So the NSA, it allows for detention for up to 12 months. And get this, without any formal charges even being filed.
A whole year.
Yep. And the reasons for detention, they can be pretty broad. Threats to national security, disrupting essential services, even just maintaining public order.
Hold on. So someone can be detained just on the suspicion that they might disrupt something. That seems like a ton of power for the authorities.
You're getting it. See, the idea is to prevent that potential threat, right? Not wait until something bad actually happens. But, it's not totally a free-for-all. The NSA does require a review by an advisory board. They can uphold the detention, or they can say, nope, let them go.
Okay, so there's some oversight, at least. Yeah. But this whole concept of preventive detention, where does that even fit in with, the Indian Constitution?
The Constitution. A great question, especially for the UPSC folks out there. So Article 22, that's the one that deals with preventive detention. It says it's okay in certain situations, but also lays down some safeguards to prevent misuse.
So it's kind of walking a tightrope, huh?
Yeah.
Balancing security needs with individual rights.
Exactly. And that's precisely why it's such a controversial law and, a really crucial topic for aspiring civil servants to understand.
For sure. Now, before we jump into how this is all playing out in Manipur, let's take a look at some of the criticisms of the NSA. I'm guessing there are a few, right?
Oh, yeah. Plenty. Yeah, definitely. The NSA has faced a lot of criticism over the years, and for good reason.
So what are some of those key concerns? What are people saying about this law?
Well, one of the biggest worries is just the potential for, misuse.
Misuse.
Yeah. critics argue that the NSA could be used to silence dissent, or to target individuals without giving them proper due process. I mean, think about it. Someone can be detained for up to a year, a whole year, without even being formally charged with a crime.
Yeah, that does seem like a long time to be held without, having a chance to defend yourself in court.
Exactly. That's the concern. And even though there's that advisory board review, the one I mentioned earlier,
Right.
even that process has been criticized. People say it lacks transparency and, the detainee doesn't always have proper legal representation. So while there are these safeguards in place, there are also these very real concerns about whether they're actually effective.
It's like the need to maintain security but also uphold individual rights.
Mm,
It's a tough balance, that's for sure.
yeah.
Especially in a region like Manipur, which we were talking about.
Yeah.
It's volatile. You mentioned buffer zones earlier. Could you explain a little bit more about what those are and why they're causing so much tension?
Sure. So these buffer zones, they were created back in June 2023 to separate the Meitei community, they mainly live in the valley, from the Kukizo community who live in the hills.
Okay.
The idea was to create a separation, right? Try to prevent clashes.
Right.
But the thing is, they've actually become flashpoints themselves.
How so?
Well, you have these reports of intermittent firing coming from these bunkers that have been set up inside these buffer zones. So it's like the very measures that were meant to, reduce conflicts.
Right.
They've kind of become sources of conflict themselves.
Fighting fire with fire, it just makes things worse. And now, on top of all of that, you have the governor suggesting the use of the NSA. So what were the specific incidents that led him to propose such a, controversial measure?
Well, there are a few key things that he's pointing to. First, there's this Pambay faction of the UNLF, that's the United National Liberation Front.
Right.
They actually signed a peace pact just last year, but now they're being accused of these ceasefire violations.
Oh, wow.
And then there's Yangang Pakbi, that's one of those buffer zones we were talking about. Security forces, they ended up dismantling some bunkers that had been set up by Kukizo volunteers, and, that just led to even more friction.
So it just keeps escalating.
Yeah, and then on top of that, you have those protests you mentioned earlier, the ones organized by the Kukizo community in Kangpokpi. They turned violent. A senior police officer was even injured.
No.
And then, to complicate matters even further, armed groups, armed cadres from some of those Kukizo insurgent groups who were supposed to be confined to these designated camps, under what's called a suspension of operations agreement. Well, they were seen out on the streets trying to, control the unrest.
So you have all these different things happening at once. Ceasefire violations, tension in those buffer zones, protests turning violent, and then armed groups who are, supposed to be in these camps, they're out on the streets.
It's a very messy situation.
Definitely. So with all of this happening, what's the governor's thinking here? Why does he think the NSA is the answer?
Well, it seems like he believes the NSA can be this, tool to crack down on what he calls troublemakers and restore order, deter further unrest and violence. But whether it's really the best tool, the most effective tool in this particular situation, that's a matter of debate.
And that's where the critics come in, right?
Exactly. They're not convinced.
So what are they saying? What are their main arguments against using the NSA in Manipur?
Well, they're saying that using a law like the NSA in a place as complex and sensitive as Manipur could actually be counterproductive. It could actually backfire.
Backfire.
Yeah, alienate and radicalize certain groups, push them further away from any kind of peaceful dialogue.
So instead of quelling the unrest, it could make things worse.
That's the worry. And then there's the concern that, using the NSA could be seen as targeting one specific community over another.
Right.
Which, could make those existing tensions even worse. And let's not forget the whole history of the NSA being used to suppress dissent, rather than, actually addressing those root causes of the conflict.
So if the NSA is, potentially such a blunt instrument, what are the alternatives? Is there a better way to handle things in Manipur?
That's the big question, isn't it? The critics are saying that a more sustainable approach would involve actually addressing the underlying socioeconomic and political problems that are fueling all of this, not just cracking down on the symptoms.
So dealing with things like poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Those are deep-rooted problems. They need long-term solutions.
And those solutions are going to be a lot more complex than just using a law like the NSA, right?
Right. It's about development, dialogue, building trust between those communities. It's a much tougher, longer road.
But it's a really important discussion to have, especially for our listeners out there, the ones who are, aspiring to be civil servants. They need to be able to look at these situations from different angles. They need to understand the need for security and the need for those long-term solutions.
Absolutely. And the situation in Manipur, it's a real-world case study. It highlights this whole dilemma of balancing security and individual rights. It's a classic UPSC theme.
Yeah.
You know, that question of how do we ensure national security without sacrificing our democratic values?
It's a question you might even see on the mains exam.
Exactly. So, as you study this topic, think critically.
Yeah.
Look at the different perspectives, the historical context, the potential consequences of using a law like the NSA, especially in a fragile environment like Manipur.
Remember, the UPSC exam, it's not just about memorizing facts. It's about understanding, analyzing, forming your own opinions.
Connecting those dots,
Yeah.
seeing the big picture. And that's what we're trying to do here today.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground today, haven't we? This
Yeah.
whole thing with the NSA and Manipur.
We have a lot to digest.
It really does, bring up some key themes, especially for those of you prepping for the UPSC.
Oh, absolutely. This whole discussion, it highlights this tension between security and liberty.
Right, exactly. It's something that, it's not just India. Democracies all over the world, they struggle with this. How much security is enough? When does it start to, infringe on individual freedoms?
The tough one.
It is. So how do you, as, future policymakers, how do you navigate that?
Well, that's where critical thinking comes in. The UPSC examiners, they're not looking for easy answers, right?
Yeah.
It's not about just memorizing facts. They want to see that you can analyze these complex situations, weigh the pros and cons, form your own opinions.
So if you're tackling a question about the NSA or really any law that deals with security, don't just, spit back what you read in a textbook.
Right. Go deeper. Think about the context, the history, the potential for things to go wrong. Could this law be misused? How does it impact people's rights? Are there other solutions out there?
Show them you understand the nuances. You get the big picture. It's like, how a lawyer has to present a case.
Yeah,
It's like that. You're building an argument, a balanced argument.
exactly.
Now, as we kind of start to wrap things up here, it's important to remember that the NSA, it's just one piece of a much bigger puzzle.
Oh, definitely.
If you really want to understand India's security challenges, you've got to look at, counterterrorism strategies, human rights law, the role of the judiciary, all of that.
And don't just stick to the textbooks either. Go read actual judgments, analyze those real-world cases, stay up to date on current events.
Yeah, because the more you engage with all of this, the better prepared you'll be. Not just for the UPSC exam, but
Yeah.
for a career in, public service.
Exactly.
This deep dive today, think of it as like, we're giving you the tools, the framework, some things to think about. Now it's your turn to go dig deeper.
Right. Keep learning. Keep that critical thinking going. Sharpen those skills.
And if you found this deep dive helpful on your UPSC journey, well, you know what to do. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more deep dives like this.
We're here to help you every step of the way. We're rooting for you all. We want you to be those amazing leaders that India needs.
The brilliant, ethical, insightful kind.
That's right. So keep learning, keep pushing yourselves. Until next time.
See you then.